Well, we're starting this 4-week series on Daniel. And as I was reflecting on this story, I thought about how over the last 2,000 years of church history, the last 2,000 years since there has been a church, Christians have attempted again and again to set themselves apart from the rest of the world, from the greater surrounding culture. We Christians, we've often wanted to stand out as people who follow Christ. You know, being Christian ought to make us different. But these attempts at separation have had somewhat mixed results. It's sometimes been really good and positive, and sometimes it's been not so good. So the earliest Christians, right after the time of Jesus, they lived very distinct lives from the rest of the culture around them, the Roman Empire. The church was one of the few places in their society where you would come together with people of different races, languages, backgrounds, education statuses, and classes. See, the church was home to men and women, Jew and Greek, kids and adults, slave and free, people who were citizens of Rome and people who weren't citizens, the uneducated and the educated, the poor and the rich. And this was really different than the rest of the Roman Empire, where it was really isolated and you only stuck within your group or your society. But in the church, it didn't matter who you were. All were welcome. And that made Christianity a pretty radical and countercultural movement in those first couple of centuries after Jesus. And these earliest Christians, they adopted some practices that made them different from the rest of the world, that made them unique and set them apart. We can read about that in Acts chapter 2. And we find that these earliest Christians, they shared their possessions with one another. They gave away their money to the poor. They met together for prayer and worship. They joined together in one another's homes for food and fellowship. The early Christians would even take in orphaned babies off the streets, babies that were left neglected to die, and they would raise them as their own children. One of the earliest practices or rituals that the church established that we still practice today is the sacrament of Holy Communion. However, the surrounding culture of the Roman Empire, they misinterpreted what the Christians were doing. You know, they heard about the Christians eating the body of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ, and they thought that this was some dark ritual where the Christians practiced cannibalism. And they even said that must be why they're taking in all the orphaned babies off the street. So this was one of those things where the church was setting itself apart as different, but it got misconstrued along the way. Later on, the Roman Empire legalized Christianity. They actually made Christianity the official religion of the land around the year 380. And since then, Christianity was a lot more mainstream or commonplace. Christians no longer needed to set themselves apart from the rest of the culture because Christianity was a part of the dominant culture. And this was generally the case until, you see some movements throughout church history, like the Methodist movement, where they said, no, we need to be different. We need to set ourselves apart. And one of those movements happened in the 1800s here in America, and it was called the Holiness Movement. So Christians at that time, they believed that the church had become complacent, that the church no longer was distinct or different from the rest of the culture around them. And so they once again wanted to become countercultural. They wanted to set themselves apart, just like those early Christians in Acts. So the Holiness Movement, they stood up against things like slavery and segregation that were commonplace in the regular society. They opened their churches to Black and white Christians, poor and rich Christians. They began things like the temperance movement. They pushed to make alcohol illegal because they believed that it led to a lot of bad things like abuse and violence and poverty. Often these holiness Christians, they would even dress differently. They would choose really plain or modest clothing instead of really rich, fine garments and jewelry. And they didn't do things like participate in gambling or dancing or going to the theater or playing cards. They wanted to set themselves apart from the greater culture, believing that that pointed people back to Christ. Now, unfortunately, they had really good intentions, but along the way, some of those aspirations became misconstrued. See, I was raised in a denomination that was an offshoot of this holiness movement. And for a lot of my life, I believed that being a good Christian meant following a list of rules, going by a list of do's and don'ts. I thought that good Christians were people who didn't drink or smoke or chew or run with those who do. That was the saying. Good Christians didn't go to the movies or listen to secular music. We only listened to Christian radio. Good Christians didn't go to the dances. Good Christians dressed modestly and not in any clothing that was too tight or too revealing. Good Christians were the ones that read their Bible every day and went to church every week. Now, none of those things are bad in and of themselves. Again, really good intentions. But when we try to set ourselves apart from the world using all these external factors, sometimes we lose or forget what it really means to be countercultural, what it really means to be set apart for God in ways that matter. So I think that's where the book of Daniel really comes in handy. You see, Daniel and his friends, they're a guide for what it looks like to live counterculturally and to follow God even in a land that doesn't always believe the same way. So the book starts off by telling us about these four young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were literally plucked from their own home and from their own Jewish culture and forced to move 1,000 miles away to live among their enemies in Babylon. After the Babylonian conquest of their home in Judea and the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, they took back all the elite members of society, those who were part of the royal family, those who were rich or educated or had special skills and special jobs, and they took them as hostages or slaves, perhaps, and they forced them to live in their own land and adapt to this new culture. So let's think about some of the ways that Daniel and his buddies had to adapt to the Babylonian culture. Well, first, they were living in a new country. Like I said, it was about 1,000 miles away from where they lived. And this is a time before airplanes and trains and cars. I just came back from vacation over in Europe, and I can tell you culture shock is real. By the end of our 2 weeks, I was ready to be in my own home, in my own bed, where people spoke my language, to have a place that I knew and recognized. But of course, that wasn't an option for Daniel and his friends. They weren't there just for 2 weeks. That was their new life reality. Next, they had to learn a new language. Daniel and his friends had grown up speaking Hebrew, the language of God's people, but they were instead forced to learn Aramaic, the language of the Babylonians. And this was in the time before Duolingo and Rosetta Stone, so they just had to figure it out. And like I said with the kids, they were given new names that reflected Babylon's gods and not the God of Israel. I think that being given a new name is one of the most disrespectful and insulting things you can do to a person. When you aren't calling someone by their chosen name, you are disregarding their identity, their heritage, their family, and you're essentially telling them, no, you are who I say that you are. Next, they had new jobs. We don't know how young or old Daniel and his friends were. They were probably in their late teens. And when they were taken as captives, they were put in this 3-year kind of training program, kind of like a college or work, work experience. And in this training program, they were being trained to serve the king of Babylon. So they had to learn all about Babylon history and customs and traditions. And then, of course, like I said with the kids, they were forced to worship new gods. Babylon did not recognize the God of the Jewish people. And instead, they followed false gods and idols. So Daniel was taken from his place of worship and forced to worship a different God. This becomes a big problem later on when he continues to pray to the God of Israel and he gets thrown in the lion's den. That's a story for another week. And finally, Daniel and his friends were forced to eat new food. And this for them was just the last straw. As good Jewish men, they had kept a kosher diet for most of their lives. They followed the Jewish dietary customs and laws. So what that meant was that they didn't eat any pork or any shellfish. They didn't eat things like meat and dairy together. Of course, there's still many Jews who continue to eat kosher even today. But now Daniel and the others were told that they had to eat what the king provided for them, even if it didn't follow their religious customs or the Jewish dietary laws. And so again, this is where Daniel and his friends drew the line. You can give me a new name, you can give me a new language, but you can't give me new food. I can kind of relate to that. But as people who had committed their whole lives to following after God, this was just one way that they could not succumb to the Babylonian culture. I want to reread verse 8 again. It says that Daniel decided he wouldn't pollute himself with the king's rations or the royal wine. And he appealed to the chief official in hopes that he wouldn't have to do so. So as we read in the story, he comes to kind of this agreement with the royal guard and the officials, and Daniel and his 3 friends were given food to eat that complied with the Jewish dietary laws. And it was mostly just fresh fruits and vegetables and plain water. And as they ate differently, it was one way that they chose to be countercultural, that they set themselves apart to follow God. And over time, they actually became stronger and healthier than the other men in the king's service. God blessed them, and they found favor with the king and with the royal officials. Now, I want to stop us right there before I go any further. I don't want us to miss the point of this story, to misinterpret what is happening and what's going on. Many Christians use this story to point out the ways in which we too need to separate ourselves from the world and be countercultural, just like Daniel and his friends refused to eat the food of the Babylonians. But this story really isn't about the food. This story really isn't about promoting a kosher diet or saying it's better to eat vegetables or saying you should be a vegan. This story isn't about the food at all. And we miss the point entirely when we make it about external factors like eating food. I think this story is actually about what it means to live meekly and humbly, to practice simplicity, to earn the respect of those around you, even those in power over you. See, Daniel was countercultural not because of what he ate, but because of how he acted. And how he showed kindness and respect even towards his enemies, all while staying true to his beliefs. See, Daniel was countercultural first because he practiced simplicity. This isn't something we talk a whole lot about in the church, but I think that for Daniel, it would have been really easy for him to get caught up in all the excess and the glamour and the temptations of the Babylonian Empire. This was the strongest power of their day. And it would have been really easy for him to just engorge himself on the food he was given, to become greedy and materialistic. But instead, he and his friends chose to live simply, to live modestly, including in what they ate. And I think like Daniel, we too live in a culture, in a society that is marked by excess, that is marked by greed and consumerism. We are told we need to have the latest and greatest, the best, the most money, the finest foods, the most expensive designer clothes. And it's really easy to give into those temptations of the empire and believe that we deserve to have it all. I saw on social media just today a quote where someone said, I think the sin of gluttony really isn't about food, but I think the sin of gluttony is when we have full bellies and those around us are going hungry. That really stuck with me. Resisting the empire and being countercultural for Christ means that we resist this temptation to give in to our greed, to give in to our lust and our gluttony, our desire to have more and more and more. Instead, being countercultural means living a life of simplicity, taking what we need and no more, living lives of sustainability, giving to others instead of keeping it all to ourselves and hoarding our wealth. Like those first Christians in Acts, simplicity means sharing with one another, giving to the poor. And so practicing simplicity is one way that we too can be countercultural. It might involve the food we eat, but of course it's so much bigger than that. Secondly, Daniel was countercultural by being meek and humble. Again, those aren't words that we usually hear a lot in our society. He was a foreign-born slave. He was a member, though, of the Jewish elite. And because of that, that gave him some power. That gave him some privilege. He was placed in this position of power as a servant to the king of Babylon. And it would have been really easy for him to become enthralled by this power and all the privileges that came along with it. He could have used this power to his advantage to make himself better. But he never thought of himself as better than the others, and he never said that he was deserving of the power that he had been bestowed. So similarly for us, being countercultural also means being humble, staying grounded. In our society, we are praised for watching out for number one, protecting your ego, protecting your own self-image, making yourself look good. But being countercultural, I would assert even being Christ-like, it means going against these instincts to protect ourselves and our own interests. One of my favorite passages in the whole Bible is in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. And it says, "Don't do anything for selfish purposes, but with humility think of others as better than yourselves. Instead of each person watching out for their own good, watch out for what is better for others. Adopt the attitude that was in Jesus Christ." I mean, wouldn't this world be a much better place if we all lived by that passage? If we all looked out for one another's interests? If we all cared for others the way that we often care for ourselves? That would truly be countercultural. Finally, Daniel was countercultural because he earned the respect of those around him, even those in authority over him. Daniel took this huge risk by asking a favor of the royal guards and the officials and requesting that they go against the king's orders. But through his request, Daniel ultimately earned their trust and earned the favor and the respect of the king. As a reminder, here's how the story ends. These are the last couple of verses that I read. When the time came to review the young men as the king had ordered, the chief official brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And when the king spoke with them, he found no one as good as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they took their place in the king's service. And whenever the king consulted them about any aspect of wisdom or understanding, he found them head and shoulders above all the dream interpreters and enchanters in the entire kingdom. Daniel stayed in the king's service until the first year of King Cyrus's reign. So even though Daniel and his friends were forced to be servants to a foreign king in a land that didn't respect their religion, their beliefs, or their customs, in a place where they were outside the larger prevailing culture, even though all that was going on, they remained respectful and kind to those around them. And they exemplified what it looked like to follow God and love others. And ultimately, they were rewarded for their actions and their behaviors. Kind of seems a little silly, but this story in Daniel reminds me of the job I worked at during college. I was a college student at at Mid-American Nazarene University in Olathe, Kansas, and I worked at Bath and Body Works at the local mall. And a couple of my friends, we all worked together at the same Bath and Body Works for a few years during college. And I really remember one time the store manager pulled me and my friend Kirsten aside. And she said, "You students from MNU are the best workers we have. You are always on time for your shifts. You never show up hungover like you'd expect from college students. You make arrangements for someone to fill in for you if you know you're going to be sick or out of town. You are always so good with our customers. You're respectful towards your coworkers and bosses. You have great attitude. You never complain. I wish we had more employees like you two. Any of your friends can come and work for me and I will be sure to give them a job. I think my friends and I stood out among our coworkers not because of how we dressed or what we ate or what music we listened to or even that we went to a Christian college. We were respected by our boss and by our coworkers because we just did our best to love God and be kind to the people we encountered. And ultimately, we excelled at our work. I was at that job for a little over 4 years, and I got promoted to be a shift lead and took on other responsibilities. Again, not because I was doing anything, differently, but just because I was trying to be a good employee and a good person who followed after God. So many times, I think that we find it difficult to be Christ-like or to be countercultural. Growing up, I always thought that doing the right thing meant doing the hard thing, that it was difficult and costly to follow after Christ, that being a Christian put me at odds with the surrounding culture in a very negative way. I thought that it was admirable to be viewed as different or even weird. I grew up with DC Talk. We were supposed to be Jesus freaks. I was taught that I should feel proud if I was picked on or persecuted because of my beliefs. After all, Jesus said that we would be persecuted by following after him. However, when I think about it these days, I think I missed the point of what it meant to be countercultural. Just like we often miss the point of this story in Daniel. We think Christianity is all about rules, do's and don'ts, who is in and who is out. We make it about all these external factors, what we wear, what we watch, what we eat. But I'm not sure that being countercultural for Christ is really all that hard. I don't think it's that hard to be kind, to be loving, to be caring, to respect others. In fact, I actually think it's harder to go out of your way to treat others poorly, to be mean, and to call them names. We make Christianity and religion into this really hard, complicated thing. But it's really not that hard. It all boils down to loving God and loving others. Being Christ-like, being countercultural means simply being loving, being kind, being humble, treating others with dignity and respect, living with simplicity, not being greedy, not taking more than your fair share. And doing these things, it may put us at odds with the rest of the world, but I don't think that has to be a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. As Christians, we should be different, but in good ways, in ways that earn the respect and favor of those around us, in ways that people look at us and they say, I want what they have. We're going to close today by singing one of my favorite songs, and it's the song, "They Will Know We Are Christians by Our Love." They will know we are followers of Christ by our love, not by our clothes, not by our food, not by what we do or don't do. They will know we are Christians, as the song goes, when we work side by side to guard human dignity and save human pride. They will know we are Christians by our love.